How is this related to this? 2023 has seen major news that had an impact on our world's climate, from floods to earthquakes to wars. In this mini documentary, we will deep dive into how wars are making our Earth warmer and what are the potential solutions to reduce their impact on climate change. But first, take a look at this animation here. The blue shows areas cooler than average and the red shows areas warmer than average. As we move forward with the years, we can see that more of the red start to show up and the blue almost disappears by the time we reach 2022. So why am I sharing this information? It is important to first showcase the serious threat that the climate change is shaping on our Earth today, before discussing how wars impact global warming. And now, we are ready.
Nepal has lost close to 1/3 of its size in just over 30 years. Antarctica and Greenland are losing billions of tons of ice mass every year.
How is war a factor of climate change? The extensive usage of heavy weaponry, the usage of landmines, the destroying of ammunitions, and many more play a role in this. Non-renewable fuels, which include coal, oil, and natural gas, supply about 80% of the world's energy. When burned, they release carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. This causes heat to be trapped in our atmosphere, making fossil fuels major contributors to climate change.
For me, it's the environmental destruction. So, for example, the destruction of dams is an example, which are often targeted in armed conflicts. If, for example, dam is damaged, it can potentially flood the whole area that is depending or is related to that dam. And by that, the ecosystems and the environments surrounding the dam will be affected, and the ability of the ecosystems to help with climate change will just not be there. The ecosystem will be not resilient.
For a very specific understanding of it, you can look at it as direct and indirect emissions that come from wars. The direct emissions are just the combustion of fossil fuels for the energy generation, and also the fact that generally when it comes to war, we're likely to use cheaper fuels rather than, let's say, electricity or more renewable energy forms, because in a war, the main goal is to try to leverage your resources to succeed. And your goal is to do that with the highest chances of success. If that means preserving your funds in order to be able to do this with, let's say, extra resources on hand, it's much more likely to be what's going to be taking place during those operations. In addition to that, you have indirect emissions. So those can come, for example, from the loss of vegetation that I mentioned earlier. But also, if you invoke damages to other countries, then that means that those countries now have to distribute funds directly towards loss and damage and trying to repair those. And everything that you do to them means that they are now more likely to impact climate change. So by proxy, the effect of the war from one country towards another is that both countries are now going to be much less capable of combating climate change. So again, the last part I think we could raise as well is that indirect tension that arises now when it comes to the United Nations. So long as different countries are at war, it means they're all going to be less likely to be able to coordinate and cooperate together when it comes to setting policies and understandings in terms of how we're going to try to collectively combat climate change.
According to a report by the Watson Institute of Brown University, between 2001 and 2017, the US military emitted 1.2 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases. The report also said that 400 million metric tons of greenhouse gases were due to war-related fuel consumption. Global greenhouse gas emissions per capita have slightly increased in 2022 by 0.4%, bringing its overall increase to 8.3% between 1990 and 2022. But how serious is the threat of wars on climate change?
I think, the world is a complex place. It's not easy to just say war will cause more climate change or climate change will cause more wars, because society is complex. If we're in a country where already there's depletion of natural resources, there's poor governance in place, where people are on the front line, they're fighting for water or food or other resources, and they're not getting supported by their government. And then climate change on top of that, if there's a heat wave or a storm or a major flood, that can just cause tipping points to happen where there will be more social unrest and so on. So I think it's kind of these factors combined together to make the risk more acute, and especially more acute in countries that are already on the front line of climate change as well. It could lead to more internally displaced people as well. So if you have an area that's more prone to drought and flooding, where it's already causing people to want to move to more urban areas, they're not getting the right kind of support or jobs and livelihoods in those urban areas. It can lead to people being more on the poverty line. And then, if there's issues around unrest in that country and the government not necessarily supporting them, that can cause uprising and civil wars, for example, as we've seen before. So it's like I said, I think it's hard to disentangle individual factors like that, but they all do work together because the world is complex.
China, the United States, India, the European Union, Russia, and Brazil were the 6 world largest greenhouse gas emitters in 2022. And militaries around the world account for about 6% of all greenhouse gas emissions. But the issue is that multiple governments don't report information on emissions from military activities.
The main thing with military operations is that if you were to try to disclose all of your emissions, we have this thing known as an element of transparency when it comes to greenhouse gas inventories. The strength of your inventory, which is how much you've emitted within a certain time frame, can only really be validated if we knew exactly how you put it together. That means for a military operation to start imparting what its emissions are, it would also have to specify how it derived all those emissions. And that breaches a lot of confidentiality in terms of operations, future plans, and so on. So for the element of safety, they would definitely try to avoid sharing any of that information at the risk that that type of leakage would then find its way towards other countries that they may have, let's say, tension with.
Yeah, I think there's been some estimates done, though, regardless of whether they're disclosed or not. I know, the world's militaries, according to a report in The Guardian, account for an estimated 6% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And also, in the US, apparently the Department of Defense's buildings account for about 40% of its fossil fuel use. So it's pretty major. I think it's important that countries, as part of general disclosure of their emissions, as part of their national inventory development, should outline in more detail where their emissions are coming from, which includes military and defense facilities. Obviously, maintenance of an army will require a certain degree of emissions associated with whether it's the barracks for the army or maintenance of the shipping and the Air Force, for example. And in times of war, when they are used, it's going to exacerbate that emissions from them.
Now let's take a quick look at how the Russia-Ukraine war negatively affected climate change. A report by carbon accounting experts has calculated that the first 12 months of the war will trigger a net increase of 120 million tons of greenhouse gases, which is equivalent to the annual output of Singapore, Switzerland, and Syria combined. And currently, the war between Hamas and Israel is also expected to leave a negative impact on climate change, especially that until this moment, no ceasefire agreement has been reached.
Different wars will have different levels of impact. Currently, the best way to classify how a war is going to impact climate change is both how intense the war currently is. So let's say the level of interaction between the two countries and just how much, let's say, devastation is being as a result of it. But in addition to that, it's how long the war has gone on for. So even a very mild war where let's say that there isn't as strong tension and it's happening throughout time, that will accumulate over, let's say, 10 to 20 years, where something like what's happening right now between Israel and Gaza, for example, is actually quite high in tension. Its developments are happening very regularly. I'd argue that, again, the way that they impact it is quite significant, and we are likely to see some ramifications. But I think the issue with a very intense war, specifically like the one we saw between Russia and Ukraine, is that a lot of this warfare leads to things like, let's say, pipelines being burst, right? And I believe that specifically in Ukraine, 2 of their major pipelines had burst, releasing some of the largest volumes of methane we've ever seen into the atmosphere. And methane, as you know, is a very potent greenhouse gas. Depending on which assessment report you report to, it could be anywhere from 21 to 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide.
Sure. Well, I think with the war in Gaza, it's too early to tell how it's all going to play out, and I can't really comment on that apart from just saying on a human level, it's just a complete tragedy what's happening. I think with the war in Ukraine with Russia, I think one of the worrying things has been, from a climate perspective, is a lot of European countries have actually started putting in place energy subsidies to prop up their fossil fuel industry because they want to reduce their reliance on Russian oil and gas. That is leading to a rollback on climate commitments, and because countries want to be more independent and have their own fossil fuel supplies, and that's actually one of the best things countries can do to wean themselves off oil and gas is to be more independent by having their own renewable energy.
The burning of oil wells also impacts climate change. For example, the blazing of oil wells during the 1991 Gulf War, which accounted for 2 to 3% of global emissions that year. 700 of Kuwait's oil fields were also set ablaze, and 11 million barrels of crude oil were poured into the Arabian Gulf. And inland, almost 300 oil lakes formed on the surface of the desert, polluting the soils for decades. A United Nations report said that the destruction of oil wells in Kuwait during the war sparked further calls to strengthen legal protection of the environment during wartime.
The one example does come to my mind of kind of potentially large-scale emission release during the war was actually in Gulf War, where I believe around 700 oil wells in Kuwait were set ablaze. And it is not uncommon for oil depots to be targeted in armed conflicts, which will inevitably contribute towards the emissions in that area, or even global emissions.
But what are countries doing to eliminate the negative effects of military emissions on climate change? Scientists and environmental groups are pressuring the United Nations to force armies to disclose their emissions. The NATO, for example, told Reuters it had created the methodology for its members to report their emissions. And it recently urged member states to reach net zero military emissions also by 2050. The US Defense Logistics Agency, which oversees oil buying, said 84 million barrels were purchased in 2022. That was down almost 15 million barrels from 2018. And emissions in 2022 fell to 48 million tons from 51 million tons in 2021. In February of 2022, the Washington Post reported the US Army's first ever climate strategy. The aim of their plan is to end the Army's emissions in half by 2030, electrifying all non-combat vehicles by 2035 and creating electric combat vehicles by 2050.
Well, just this morning I was reading an interesting article talking about how use of solar rooftop systems in Gaza has helped certain communities to actually deal with blackouts, because it's easier to bomb fossil fuel plants, centralized power production systems, but decentralized systems like solar can help build more resilience in communities as well. So in disaster hit communities or in other areas, being more decentralized, having solar power, renewables can be a bit of a win-win. It builds that resilience when there are wars or disasters that hit. And it means it can be done in a clean way, that development. It can help reduce your emissions by not relying on fossil fuels. And it's cheaper as well to have your distributed rooftop solar systems in place.
Wars are playing a major role in making our Earth warmer. And the world has been tackling the issue of climate change in different industries. But do you think countries will put military emissions on the table at COP28? And will we see a noticeable move when it comes to militaries eliminating their emissions? Let's see. I'm Farah Heiba. Thank you for watching.